Effects of KemTRACE Cr Level and feeding regimen on finishing pig growth performance and carcass characteristics. Research on the effects of supplemental chromium for growing and finishing pigs has been conducted since the 90s. A primary metabolic role for which chromium is known is the alteration of tissue sensitivity to insulin, which is manifested as increased insulin efficiency. Moreover, the mineral is involved in the uptake of amino acids and in the metabolism of nucleic acids and lipids. Typical corn and soybean meal diets contain from 750 up to 3,000 parts per billion chromium. However, most of it is unavailable and is poorly absorbed in the GI tract. In fact, the absorption of chromium from vegetable diets has been reported to be as low as 0.4 to 3% only. In finishing pigs, the interest has focused on the potential use of supplemental chromium to increase carcass leanness by decreasing fat content or increasing muscling. A recent meta-analysis published in 2011 indeed showed that supplemental chromium has the potential to increase carcass percentage lean and carcass yield, and also to improve growth performance by increasing average daily gain and improving feed efficiency. However, results are inconsistent, and some authors do not observe changes in growth performance and in carcass characteristics. Therefore, it is suggested that chromium dose and feeding duration could impact the degree of improvement observed. With this in mind, the objective of our trial was to evaluate the effects of chromium supplementation and feeding regimen on growth performance and carcass characteristics of finishing pigs that were housed under commercial conditions. For this trial, we used a total of 1,206 pigs with an initial average body weight of 48.9 kilograms. These pigs were placed in mixed gender pens with 27 pigs each, and they were blocked by initial body weight. We had 3 treatments in this trial. First, a control diet without added chromium. Second, a diet with 200 parts per billion added chromium in grower phase and 100 parts per billion added chromium during the finisher phase. And third and final treatment, diets with 200 parts per billion added chromium in both grower and finisher phases. Each treatment had 15 replicates, and the chromium source used in this trial was chromium propionate. These are the experimental diets. They were corn, soybean meal, and DDGs based, and they were fed in 4 phases. Phases 1 and 2 corresponded to the grower period from 49 to 92 kilograms body weight, and phases 3 and 4 corresponded to the finisher phase from 92 to 124 kilograms body weight. Diets were formulated to meet or exceed animals' requirements and contain 0.89, 0.78, 0.71, and 0.65% SID lysine from phases 1 to 4. KemTRACE chromium was added in different levels to form the different dietary treatments at the expense of corn. At the end of the experimental period, pigs were marketed to evaluate the following carcass characteristics: hot carcass weight, carcass yield, back fat thickness, loin depth, and percentage lean. Data were analyzed using the Glimix procedure of ASAS with pen as the experimental unit. Chromium dose was included as a fixed effect and block as a random effect. Linear and quadratic contrast statements were built to evaluate the effect of increasing chromium levels during the finisher phase, and in the grower period and in the overall period, pairwise comparisons were made. Significance was accepted when p-values were equal to or smaller than 0.05, marginally significant when p-values were greater than 0.05, but equal to or smaller than 0.10. Moving on to the results, I'd like to take a moment to set up the graphs. On the x-axis, we have the dietary treatments. So if you recall, in the grower phase, we only had two treatments, a control diet without added chromium, and the diet with 200 parts per billion added chromium. And on the y-axis, we have the different response variables. There was no evidence for differences in average daily gain during the grower period. Also, there was no evidence for differences in average daily feed intake during the grower period. And similarly, we did not observe evidence for differences in feed efficiency during the grower period as well. Now moving on to the results of the finisher phase. Here we had 3 dietary treatments: control diet without added chromium, a diet with 100 parts per billion added chromium, and a diet with 200 parts per billion added chromium. So some of the pens that previously received 200 parts per billion added chromium during the grower phase started receiving 100 parts per billion added chromium to form this treatment. We observed a quadratic effect on average daily gain during the finisher phase, where there was no improvement when we increased the chromium level from the control to 100 parts per billion added chromium, but we observed an increase in average daily gain when 200 parts per billion added chromium diet was fed. There was no evidence for differences in average daily feed intake during the finisher period, and means ranged from 2.94 kilograms to 2.99 kilograms. Also, there was no evidence for differences in feed efficiency during the finisher period. Now moving on to the overall results from 49 to 124 kilograms body weight. Here we observed a marginally significant difference in average daily gain, where pigs fed diets with 200 parts per billion added chromium in both grower and finisher phases had greater average daily gain than pigs fed the control diets. With pigs fed diets with 200 parts per billion added chromium during the grower phase and 100 parts per billion chromium during the finisher phase, intermediate. However, there was no evidence for differences in average daily feed intake in the overall period, and the means ranged from 2.63 up to 2.66 kilograms. And similarly, there was no evidence for differences in feed efficiency in the overall period. Moving on to the results of the carcass characteristics. There was no evidence for differences in hot carcass weight, and means range from 95.3 to 95.7 kilograms. However, we observed reduced carcass yield in pigs fed diets with 200 parts per billion added chromium in both grower and finisher phases compared to the other two treatments. This result was surprising to us. We did not expect to see this response based on previous trials conducted in our group. There was no evidence for differences in loin depth, and also no evidence for differences in back fat thickness. Finally, there was no evidence for differences in carcass lean percentage, and means range from 55 to 55.4%. In conclusion, increasing chromium supplementation resulted in minor changes in overall growth performance, with the highest average daily gain observed with 200 parts per billion added chromium in both grower and finisher phases. Chromium dose and feeding regimen did not influence carcass leanness, back fat thickness, or loin depth. However, when we fed diets with 200 parts per billion added chromium in both grower and finisher phases, we observed lower carcass yield. Thank you.